Morning, Terry.
Morning.
Right, good morning. It's now 9:30 and time for me to resume this hearing into the Corby Part 2 local plan. Now, I think we just had a quick technology check before we start that everyone can hear and see appropriately. And we have been getting a little bit of feedback just in the last few minutes, so hopefully that will die down and resolve itself. But if not, then we may have to have an adjournment to try and sort it out. But I believe on this particular session today, we have Mr. Jameson from the Council Solicitor.
Thank you, Ma'am.
Good morning.
Morning.
We have Mr. Begley, the Council Planning Officer.
Morning, Mum.
Morning. We also have Mr. Lucas from Lucas Land and Planning.
Yes, morning, Ma'am.
Good morning. Thank you. I think that's really all that the characters for our session this morning about village and rural areas. As we are all have been attending other sessions so far this week, I don't intend to go through my opening announcements. So in that case, I presume everybody is aware of our operating procedure, excuse me, and knows how we're going to proceed today. So on that basis, then, I want to start off looking at matter 7, as I said, village and rural areas, in particular policy 17, which looks at settlement boundaries. Now, as a starting point for our discussion this morning, I think it would be helpful for the council to just give a little bit of background to this policy, really, and why they feel that it's necessary to have settlement boundaries and what is their purpose. So I'll hand over to Mr. Begley, please.
Thank you, Mum. Settlement boundaries on the policies map has been a key element of planning policy in Corby for many years, and is supported by development management officers as an effective tool to clearly differentiate between the main built-up area of the village and open countryside, and assist in the application of the joint core strategy. They are considered the basis for consistent and transparent decision-making on individual plan applications. Paragraph 10.31 of the sustainability appraisal explains that settlement boundaries ensure that there is a clear understanding of land, which is in the open countryside, and will help preserve the rural character and setting of the rural settlements. The definition of the settlement boundaries is underpinned by the rural strategy reference CDCSF4 that form the basis of table 1 of the joint core strategy, and the criteria for defining settlement boundaries have been subject to consultation during the plan making process. The council did not receive any representation seeking changes to the criteria or any representation to suggest the criteria is inappropriate.
Right, okay, thank you for that introduction. Can we just spend a little time? First of all, I want to look at the actual methodology for how you've defined the settlement boundaries. And I also want to explore the rural strategy in a bit more detail as well. But firstly, in terms of how the process, the methodology that you've gone through to define the settlement boundaries in the Part 2 plan, can you outline that in a little bit more detail for me, please? I think you're muted at the moment, Mr. Begley.
Yes, sorry, I'm having a bit of a technical glitch.
Are you all right to continue?
Yes, sorry, I lost the Zoom screen.
Oh dear.
Yeah, the settlement, the actual criteria for defining the villages was subject to consultation at the emerging draft stage. It was largely a continuation of and reinforcing the approach in the joint core strategy of directing growth to the urban area and having local connecting growth to the growth towns with limiting development in the rural area and providing some scope for small-scale infill development within villages.
Okay. What I want to understand is the actual process that you went through. I'm not clear from the evidence that you've submitted to underpin this policy, how exactly you've gone about assessing the boundaries of the villages. Now, I know that the village boundaries were defined in the 97 local plan. I think they were actually termed as village confines, was that right? So it has moved on a little, terminology's changed. But what I want to understand is the process that the authority went through in assessing those village boundaries. How did you check them? Did you sense check them? You consulted on the criteria. How did you then go through a process of checking each individual village to determine whether those boundaries were still appropriate? How did you go about it?
In the initial stage was our issues and options, and we asked if we consulted on whether that it was appropriate to retain them. The next stage,
That's appropriate to retain them as drafted in the 97 plan, is that right?
That was one of the options, but really whether there's a need for settlement boundaries.
Right, okay.
And then having gained a degree of support for that, we set out criteria following that consultation, we did not receive any representation seeking changes to the criteria or representations to that. That was then, we then surveyed the villages and applied that criteria to each individual settlement. And then that formed the basis of the Reg 19 settlement boundaries.
Right, okay. So that survey information, is that in your evidence base?
It's presented in the Reg 19 document.
Which document exactly? What, can you give me a reference for this, please?
The actual submission document, the Part 2 local plan of policies maps with it, that associated with it.
Yeah, what I'm interested in is the background to it. How did you assess each boundary? Did you look at individual sites? Did you look at, is the boundary still appropriate because certain developments taken place? Did you look at individual sites on the boundaries of villages and determine where the boundary should go? Is it still appropriate in that location? Did you do a report, shall we put it that way, to a working report that you produced yourselves to help you do that? Was it a desk-based assessment? Did you report to committee on the findings of that assessment to look at where the boundaries should go? I'm interested to know how you did it, and what evidence can you give me to show me that you did do it?
The evidence is table 9 and table 10 of the emerging draft options consultation document. That sets out clearly how we would define the settlement boundaries.
Yes.
We then, the policies maps we produced then that accompanied the Reg 19 followed that criteria.
Yeah, I understand that. What I'm looking for is what evidence you can give me to show how you did that. I mean, I'm trying to understand whether or not you used that criteria. Yes, you used the criteria to look at the village boundaries. Was that an exercise that officers undertook, but you didn't actually report that or write that down in a process or a reporting document? Is that the case?
Yeah, I mean, the criteria is subject to consultation. There was no objections to it, so we used that criteria then to draw the lines on the map, and then that was presented in the Reg 19 document. Right,
so I understand that. All I'm just trying to find out is whether or not there's a piece of work that your team did that isn't in the evidence base that shows how you've looked at each individual boundary, similar to you do say to a greenbelt boundary. So on looking at whether a greenbelt boundary is appropriate, you might go out on site, you have a look at where that boundary is drawn. Is it still appropriate? Has there been some other development, which means the boundary should change for whatever reason? How did you go about it? Did you do a sense check on site to see whether the boundaries are appropriate, whether there's been some change in the village which might suggest the boundary should be in a different location? This is what I'm trying to establish. I hope you understand what I mean.
I do. There's no record of that. We used, following no objections to the criteria, we then used GIS, map-based surveys, site visits where necessary to then translate that criteria into lines on a map. But that's not audited or recorded for however.
Right. Okay. That's what I'm trying to get at. Yeah. So as long as I understand you did the process, is what I'm trying to establish today, is that you used GIS data, you've used aerial photographs, presumably, you did site visits where you felt it was necessary to check those boundaries, to sense check them. So the culmination of that exercise, did that mean that the boundaries were altered in any position?
There was amendments, but I'm not going to be able to pinpoint them out for you.
Right. Okay. What I might ask you to do then is just so that I understand, it indicates that the process it suggests the process has been undertaken in a thorough and robust way. So if you can provide me with a statement which demonstrates that you've gone through the process and outlines for me where the changes have occurred as a result of that exercise. Because it's not clear to me at the moment is how you've gone from the village boundaries on the 97 local plan to what you're now proposing in the current Part 2 plan. I just want to see that you've done that assessment, that's robust, that it's reasonable and proportionate, and that you have altered it in places where you felt it was appropriate and why. It doesn't need to be a very long document, but it just establishes for me that, in effect, those boundaries have been properly checked and you have looked at current circumstances to ensure that they are appropriate. So if I ask you to do that, as one of your points of work to do, I think that would be helpful. Right, so moving on from that, in looking at the boundaries and where they've been set, the criteria I know you have mentioned, did those, in looking at where to set the boundaries, did you consider the need for flexibility to look at how those villages may grow?
No, it's following the strategy, the joint core strategy that is limiting development in the rural areas. We felt a continuation of that approach would be appropriate. And in the context of our oversupply in the rural areas, it wasn't considered appropriate to include additional flexibility.
Right, okay. In looking at the boundaries that are defined on the policies map, did that take account of, for example, planning permissions within those villages? Did you include the assessment of that, or sites, committed sites with permission that may well be more appropriate to be within the boundary of the village? Was that part of the assessment?
Yes, table 9 includes, one of the bullet points is areas of land currently with planning permission which adjoin the built up area are included, and also local plan allocations are included.
Right, okay, that's good. Thank you for that. That just clarifies that point. That's helpful. I think what I want to move on to now is the reference in your hearing statement to the rural strategy. If I just get it up and just bear with me a minute because I've got it somewhere. It's disappeared temporarily. Technology for you again. Never mind, I'll have to find it again, I think. So the rural strategy, just bear with me while I get it up on my screen. Yes, April 2009. Now, in your hearing statement, you say that your approach is underpinned by the rural strategy. I just want to understand a little bit about the relationship of the rural strategy and how that has been used in terms of the definition of the village boundaries. And again, it comes back to process to an extent and methodology. The rural strategy has some age. It's 2009. So to what extent is that document fundamental to the approach you've taken? I'm just concerned a little bit about the fact that it is effectively 11 years old. And clearly things have moved on from a national policy perspective since this document was put together. Can you help me with that particular question? How does this fit into your approach?
Yeah, the rural strategy was produced under the remit of the previous core spatial strategy, which had a similar approach of directing development towards the urban areas and limiting development in the rural areas. The criteria principles set out in paragraph 9.3 of the rural strategy are fairly similar to those that were included in table 9 of the emerging draft options.
So they are similar. Are they more or less the same, or is there any deviations, any particular areas that are different?
Quick scan of them both now, they look exactly the same.
Wording might have changed slightly, but they are pretty well the same. Yeah.
And the rural strategy is an old document, but it formed the basis for table 1 in the joint core strategy. Indeed, the evidence that informed the joint core strategy, I'm not sure if it's in our examination library, but it was in the joint core strategy examination library, developing a settlement hierarchy for Northamptonshire joint core strategy background paper, published in July 2012. That was formed on the basis of our rural strategy and took forward them findings in terms of informing the approach to table 1 in the joint core strategy. So it certainly is consistent with the joint core strategy and it formed the basis of it.
Right, okay. Okay, then I noticed looking at the introduction to the rural strategy, it says the paper aims to clarify the process undertaken towards the formulation of the village confines policy. So how does that relate? Clearly, village confines is how it's termed in the previous local plan. So effectively, it's the village boundaries. But so how does this document, how does it underpin what you're doing now?
It underpins it because it formed the basis of the settlement hierarchy in the joint core strategy, and also it set out the principles that we would define. It set out the criteria to define those village confines, which we've taken forward as the criteria to define the settlement boundaries.
Right, okay. I think that explains some of that for me. What's interesting with the rural strategy is that it looks at individual villages. On section 10 of that, page 7, it looks at results and looks at individual villages and sets boundaries for those. So just to be clear, those boundaries obviously were in place at the time the core strategy was adopted. You've since looked at the criteria again. You've done a further analysis of the individual villages, applying those criteria, which has then led to the revised boundaries which you're putting forward on the policies map in the Part 2 local plan. So again, it probably comes back to the piece of work I've asked you to do, but have there been alterations to the boundaries since those villages outlined in the rural strategy to that's currently proposed in the Part 2 plan?
Yeah, I think we have to set that out in the
Yes.
requested.
Yeah, I think to an extent, this is what I'm looking for, is that it's interesting, the rural strategy in effect does some of this work at that point in time when that document was put together. I'm just looking for the next iteration of that to a degree, which demonstrates to me how you've applied the criteria and how the settlement boundaries for the villages have then been amended and what those amendments are, just for clarity, really, just to see the process and how you've arrived at the stage you're now at in terms of the boundaries.
Yes, ma'am, I understand.
Yeah, good. That's excellent then. I think that's helpful then. Okay, so that's probably all I need to say on the rural strategy itself, I think. Let me just have a look at my notes to see what, yes. So in actually looking at the villages, does the council do anything like a village health check or any other type of assessment of the villages and how they're performing?
The rural strategy sets out our profile for each village we've carried out rural housing needs surveys, but we've not done anything additional to that other than perhaps using reviews of neighbour plans.
Right, okay. So you haven't done individual, what you might call a health check. So you looked at the individual village in terms of how it's performing, what the needs of that village are, apart from the rural housing strategy, the rural housing needs assessment that we did look at yesterday. Right.
No, and the rural strategy formed the approach for the JCS strategic approach, so we've not added anything additional to that.
Right, okay, all right, that's helpful, thank you. Right, so I think what I'll come on to now then is the principles, I suppose, of whether it's appropriate to have a settlement boundary. I'm sure you're aware that there are a number of representations from various parties who have questioned the need for settlement boundaries. And a number of representatives have suggested that those settlement boundaries are too restrictive. So can I just ask you to outline for me, in your view, why you think defining the settlement limit is appropriate and it isn't too restrictive?
Our view is that defining settlement boundaries provides a clear basis and consistent basis for decision making, and has proved popular in Corby as a policy tool for a number of years.
Yeah, I understand that approach, and that's a very common approach for a number of authorities. The key element here, I suppose, is where those boundaries are actually defined and whether or not they are too tightly drawn around those settlements. Do they allow for some flexibility? Do they take account of the future needs of those settlements and allow suitable development within those settlements that is sustainable and that may also meet the local needs of that particular community? That is a point that's been raised by a number of representatives. So I'm just interested on the council's view on whether the boundaries are too restrictive.
Thank you for clarification, ma'am. The council has demonstrated in our 5-year housing land supply statement, a reference EBMON 2A, that by 2031, a minimum of 242 homes are projected to be delivered in the rural areas. That exceeds the
Can you just give me that number again? Was it 240?
242.
242, thank you.
Which exceeds the Joint Core Strategy requirements of 120 homes. That clearly indicates that strategic policies provided by the Joint Core Strategy that focus the majority of development over the planned period in the growth town, whilst limiting development in the rural areas, providing some scope for small-scale infill development within villages, are not too restrictive and provide a positive and flexible policy framework promoting sustainable development in rural areas in accordance with national policy.
Right, okay. So what's the council's view on the argument that the settlement boundaries preclude otherwise sustainable development from coming forward?
The existing policy framework and Joint Core Strategy allows sustainable developments to continue to come forward. We've got policy 11 and policy 13 that provide that flexibility. And of course, there's neighbour plans that allow communities to bring forward their own sustainable development.
Yes, we'll have a conversation about neighbour plans shortly, because I think that's an important element to the whole equation here. Okay, I mean, I think there is an argument that has been put forward, I think, by one representative in particular, that suggests that the settlement boundaries as drafted and the approach to defining settlement boundaries is inconsistent with the Core Strategy Policy 29, which indicates that levels of housing in excess of the requirements for named villages can be permitted where it's been tested and supported through the Part 2 local plan process. So what's the council's view of that?
Policy 29 is recognised, that allows further growth to be tested. Council's view is that a supply of housing land that exceeds the identified requirements for the rural area has already been identified in the Part 2 local plan, and that further additional growth can be accommodated through the existing policy framework.
Right. Okay. Can I bring Mr. Jameson at this point? Do you want to make a comment on this?
Thank you, Mum. What I wanted to put to you was this point. Of course, Part 2 plan, the document that we look to for the strategic policies is the joint core strategy. And in relation to settlement boundaries, I suppose the question is there anything in the concept of settlement boundaries which runs counter to or against the thrust of the joint core strategy? If we go back again to policy 11, the rural areas, little a, development in the rural areas would be limited to that required to support a prosperous rural community to meet a locally arising need, which cannot be met more sustainably in a nearby larger settlement. So I think what we're saying is we can demonstrate by the housing we produced in rural areas that clearly we're exceeding the targets in the joint core strategy anyway. But if there is to be in a review of the joint core strategy a different approach to housing in the rural areas, then it would be the joint core strategy that led on that. But at the moment, the settlement boundary approach is clearly giving sufficient scope to produce the housing numbers in rural areas contemplated by the joint core strategy. So it's doing its job. The settlement boundary does its job. And I think we would say that a different approach would require some different approach in the review of the JCS. That was the point. Thank you.
No, that's understandable. Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. Mr. Lucas.
Thank you, Mum. I don't want to get enmeshed in some of the comments you've already made. I completely agree with
you. Can do if you like.
No,
if you want to emphasise them, by all means, please do.
There's one point I just wanted to make. I feel there's absolutely no justification whatsoever for a settlement boundary around the rural village. We're in a policy vacuum here. There's been no rural planning since for 23 years, a whole generation here. The 1997 local plan was quite an interesting one in terms of it had a settlement hierarchy. It showed housing commitments. It showed housing allocations. It was progressive. It was proactive. We're in a vacuum now. And what's come to fill the vacuum is the neighbourhood plan groups. They've had to do that because there's been no positive planning from Corby. Corby planning has just been concerned with Corby town. So all I can say is there's no reason to define a settlement boundary on a plan. Any land outside of village is countryside. That's quite simple. It doesn't need Mr. Begley or anybody else, the officers, to get involved in long debates on whether that hedge is within. If it's outside, it's open countryside, as simple as that. And we need, therefore, to move forward on this neighbourhood plan to allow some progressive and proactive development. I actually don't see there's any need for the JCS to be involved in terms of looking at this particular issue. Undoubtedly, there's a 5-year housing land supply issue. We know that, and you'll see that. I'm utterly convinced that when you've done your work at home, looking at all the figures. And that's interesting. But actually, some other local planning authorities in Northamptonshire cover this in quite an interesting way. They say, I'll use the Daventry example, and I know Mr. Jameson's aware of that. If there's a 5-year housing land supply issue, then they're looking at other opportunities within the rural area, despite the fact the rural area apparently is over-provided, in inverted commas. I'm always a bit worried when, I think it's Mr. Begley came out with a figure on the 120 housing need. I'm actually staggered that is in the plan in any case for a start. And then for somebody to say that 242 houses at the end of the 15-year period is way in excess, to be frank, of the rural, there's something wrong somewhere, and it doesn't equate with the 2019 National Planning Policy Framework, but there needs to be flexibility. And I feel that the straitjacket around these villages inhibits flexibility, and that's my concern. That's the only reason I'm here, and I'm quite happy to talk about the fact that 30 years ago, the land I was represented was allocated in the draft plan and then taken out and put in a smaller village at Middleton, beyond belief. So that's the only reason I'm here, is to make sure that there's a belt and braces job on rural settlement planning. Whereas at the present time, there's a straitjacket, and that can't be allowable. I'm sorry, Mum, if I'm...
No, that's fine, Mr. Lucas. No, I was going to say, do you
I'm
not...
speaking with passion here, Mum.
I can see that. Do you not consider that settlement boundaries create certainty for the development?
No, I don't think there's any need. I don't think there's any need for Mr. Begley and his team to go out and look at boundaries, because any land outside the village is countryside, and therefore there needs to be a dialogue with the neighbourhood plan groups to see what they want in their village, because they've waited a heck of a long time for the 23-year period to move forward. And I hear what Mr. Begley says about the 2008 Joint Core Strategy. Well, essentially, that's what's happened again. The 2016 is a rubber stamping. It's just exactly the same. We haven't moved forward, and there is an inherent inflexibility, and that's what worries me. Thank you.
Would you not accept, Mr. Lucas, that what we're examining here is the Part 2 plan? So some of the issues that you're raising, to a degree, look at as to the strategic approach in the borough to development in the development of rural housing and development in the rural areas. So does that not point to the need to review the overall strategic approach rather than looking at what's happening within the Part 2 plan?
I agree on a general matter. It's quite clear to me that we're entering a completely different planning scenario. I'd love to be able to talk to you all day on this, and I'm sure Mr. Jameson, we could spend a lot of time talking about it, and in November we will do. Something needs to be done, I agree. So, but in terms of the rural area, I don't see any need for any line on a plan. To be frank, it looks like the lines on the plan haven't changed much since 1997, the 23-year period, apart from some allowances for development, which has been allowed as part of that plan 23 years ago. It's a long time to wait, but there we are. And that's my view, Mama. I'm not going to change, and I'm not going to be...
No, I'm not asking you to change. It's an interesting view, Lucas, which all adds to the debate, yeah.
I'm not going to be deflected from that point, because I believe in the 2016 JCS, there is some flexibility, land adjoining. I mean, you know, why do we have to have a line on a plan? It's patently obvious if land adjoins a settlement, and there's flexibility in that document. We're not talking about estate development, large estate development here. All we're talking about is allowances in the villages, what those villages want for their needs and their future. And that hasn't been allowed for a long, long time. And there is a vacuum, 2 pages in a local plan document for the rural planning. Frankly, it's not on. There we are.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, Lucas. Mr. Jameson, do your hand still up? Do you want to come back on a further point there? Sorry, you're muted.
Sorry,
Mr.
yeah, it's my fault for not pressing the right buttons when I'd finished.
We're still all getting used to this technology.
I have done now. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, then, thank you. Right, Mr. Begley, can I just come back to what you said originally when you were talking about the figures? When you were saying that up to 2031, 242 homes committed in the rural areas, which exceeds the figure of 120 in the core strategy. Well, we are where we are with what the core strategy policy suggests in terms of spatial distribution of development within the borough, and we can't revisit that in a Part 2 plan. But in terms of the figure of 242 dwellings, would you agree that there is a possibility of that increasing over the plan period? So in other words, that figure of 120 is not a limit, that the council is being proactive and positive and supporting development within those rural areas if provided it meets the policy within the core strategy in terms of the spatial distribution and the local needs. So are you content, and would you argue that there is flexibility within there because new development will not be restricted? The council is acting in a proactive and positive way.
Yes, I agree. I think the existing joint core strategy does provide that proactive and positive framework to deliver sustainable growth in the rural areas.
Okay. In terms of the position with neighbourhood plans, where are they at the moment? How far progressed rest are they?
We've got table 1 on the submitted plan.
Yeah.
Shows the latest position. The only update since that table was published is that Gretton Parish Council have now submitted their neighbourhood plan to local planning authority, and that's currently subject to examination.
All right, okay. Okay, that's good. So they're progressing. So what's the relationship between the settlement boundaries defined in the Part 2 plan and what might come forward in neighbourhood plans?
We've submitted paragraph 1.35 of the submitted Part 2 local plan explains that if neighbourhood plans are adopted in the future and include policies such as site allocations or alteration to the settlement boundaries, these neighbourhood plans will supersede the Part 2 local plan for their respective designated area.
Right, okay, that's fine. Thank you. That confirms that for me. One of the areas that's also been raised by representatives, I think, is that the trajectory for housing delivery coming forward tends to suggest that developments in the rural areas is in the earlier part of the plan period, and there is a question of whether or not there should be more of a positive approach to allow developments in the rural areas towards the latter part of the plan period. So what's the council's view of that?
I think it's this point in time, the trajectory identifies the sites that we're currently aware of. The policy, as I've explained earlier, the policy framework within the JCS provides for more growth, and we expect these to come forward towards the end of the trajectory.
Effectively, what they are windfalls and exception sites.
Yeah,
correct. Yeah. Okay. So do you feel that the council's approach provides choice and competition in the market, particularly within the rural areas?
It does within the parameters of the joint core strategy, yes.
Okay. Okay, I'm just going to look at my notes. Is there anything else I want to cover on that particular policy? I think that's it. Mr. Lucas, do you want to come back in?
Yes, just 2 points, Mark. The 242 homes that Mr. Begley's mentioned, are these actually just planning approvals? Are they? But what is the situation on those? Is it have they been built?
Yes. So yes, Mr. Begley, are you able to help us with that, please?
Yeah, the 130 are completions, and 112 are planning commitments.
So they're permissions, effectively.
Yes.
Thank you on that point. Can I just say, in terms of the neighbourhood plan, then we're in a situation, Ma'am, with the neighbourhood plan where my client's site at Gretton is a preferred allocation site, which has been through all the hoops, and I'll tell you, there's been a lot of hoops in terms of the preferred site, residential housing site. But we're obviously Mr. Begley's settlement boundary plan cuts us out, and so my concern is, obviously, I have a concern. I see no reason for that boundary anyway, but I just raise that as an issue. So
what solution are you looking for, Mr. Lucas?
I'm looking for a thorough endorsement from Mr. Begley saying it's an excellent site today. That's what I'd like. No, to be frank, Mara, I just don't see any need for the settlement boundary because we've gone through a complete process with the neighbourhood plan group whereby over a course of many years we've emerged as a preferred site, and obviously subject to examination. And my concern is that this creates extra work. It could create extra work, extra costs for everybody concerned if the boundary. That's my concern. I see no need anyway. You understand my point of view?
I understand your point of view, yeah, but presumably for this preferred site in Gretton, if that goes through the process with the neighbourhood plan, the village boundary would then be amended to take account of that, would it not?
I hope Mr. Begley does amend it.
Okay, can I bring Mr. Begley then on that point? What would happen in that scenario, Mr. Begley?
I'd reiterate paragraph 1.3 is that if a neighbour plan is adopted in the future and includes policies that alter the settlement boundary, these neighbour plans will supersede the Part 2 local plan for their respective designated area.
Yeah, okay. That's in effect what would happen in due course should that site proceed. Yeah, okay.
But it's nice to hear it.
That's fine. I'm very happy to help. Right, so in terms of policy 17, just to have a look at the actual wording of the policy itself and the justification text before we move off this onto policy 18. Do you consider as worded the policy is effective, Mr. Begley?
Yes, it shows what the purpose of the settlement boundaries on the policies map is, and the people will understand that that's used to implement policy 11 and 13 of the JCS.
Yes. Now it's interesting you mentioned the JCS there and the policies. I was wondering whether or not the council felt to make that policy more effective and robust, whether or not it would be appropriate to actually make reference to those core strategy policies within policy 17 to say that the boundaries effectively relate to the purposes of policies 11 and 13 of the core strategy.
I've always been clear that the settlement boundary is on our policies map in part 2 is to distinguish between the countryside and the main built up area. I felt that was clear enough.
I suppose all it does is by adding reference to the core strategy policies is reinforce how those settlement boundaries are to be used and what their purpose is. Because their purpose in effect is to enable and facilitate the application of policies 11 and 13 of the core strategy. Mr. Jameson, do you have a view on this? Sorry, you're on mute, I'm afraid, Mr. Jameson.
I think the issue can be that we all know that the joint core strategy and the Part 2 plan have to be read together in any event, that they are the local plan. There is an issue, and I've met this elsewhere, even in Northamptonshire, that if I see the merit of what you're saying, but the issue that it raises is that in all those policies where you don't mention the joint core strategy policy, there is an implication somehow that the local Part 2 plan policy is standing apart from the JCS policy. Whereas we know that you've got to read them both together as a single document. That's the argument against the cross-reference on particular policies, where of course you could for every policy say this policy needs to be read alongside policy X of the joint core strategy. That's the argument that I've come across against making cross-references in Part 2 plan policies.
Okay, I think I take your point, and that's fine. I just really, not really being devil's advocate, but just raising the issue, just to explore it in a little bit more depth. What you might want to have a look at is the supporting text to this policy to make it clear that it does relate to those JCS policies of 11 and 13. I think there's a reference to policy 11 in there. I don't think 13 is referred to, particularly paragraph 8.6, where you're talking about specific policies, including the local plan for development proposals. It might be just appropriate just to expand that section a little bit, just to make it clearer how there is a relationship between policy 17 in the Part 2 plan and the policies within the core strategy in terms of other areas.
Absolutely, ma'am. I think that's very sensible, if I may say so. Yes, we'll try and do that.
Yeah, I think that's probably the way forward on this. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
If I could just come in, Mom.
Certainly, yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I see where you're aiming. It's the flexibility that we're aiming for here, isn't it? Instead of this belt approach to a village. I think that's absolutely essential. So I totally agree with you. I know where you're going, and So there's some way that we could do that. That's fine. Thank you.
Okay. All right, thank you for that comment then. Okay, so is there anything else from anybody on policy 17 and settlement boundaries? Are we all content?
Well, if we,
Well, I know you're not content, Mr. Lucas, but you're content you've had your say, put it that way.
I'm sorry to appear an old bore, Mum, but you've
No,
read
not at all.
you've
not
read
at
what we, thank you. You've read what
Okay,
we've said.
thank you very much.
So I stand by that. So there we are. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. We will then move on then to policy 18, which is the restraint villages of East Carlton and Rockingham. Perhaps you can give me a little bit about the background to this policy, Mr. Begley.
Thank you. Table 1 of the Joint Core Strategy states that Part 2 plans may identify villages that have a sensitive character or conservation area in which new development will be strictly managed. Both East Carlton and Rockingham are both entirely covered by a conservation area designation, and identifying these as restraint villages is considered to be consistent with policy 11B of the Joint Core Strategy and the objectives of both the Joint Core Strategy and the NPPF that seek to conserve and enhance the historic environment.
Right, yeah, they're interesting villages. I do want to have a look at these villages when I come and do some site visits over the next few weeks. So I think it would be an interesting exercise to have a look at them and see their character and their significance in terms of a heritage asset. So in doing this process, we have East Carlton and Rockingham. Did you consider any other villages were appropriate to be designated as restraint villages? I believe that the core strategy policy looks at villages not just having conservation interest, but also potentially a landscape character interest. So did you assess whether it was appropriate for other villages to come under this policy?
We didn't have the evidence to justify including any other villages under this policy.
So it's just these two villages that are the unique villages with the conservation interest that you feel are appropriate to be covered by this policy.
That's right.
Yeah. And how will development be achieved within those particular villages with this policy of restraint? How will their local needs be met?
In effect, they would be treated as open countryside. So any local need arising from them settlements will have to be met through the neighbour plan or community right to build.
Right. So if a development came forward that was, say, an infill within those villages, how would that be treated?
They'd be treated as open countryside, so that would be contrary to policy.
Right. So the policy only allows for the restricted to reuse and conversion of suitable buildings, or any new needs, which could be infill or development on the edge of the village boundary, provided that comes through the neighbourhood plans or community right to build. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's good. That's my understanding of that. Yeah, that's fine. Okay. I don't think I have any other questions on policy 18, to be honest. It seems relatively straightforward. So I'm happy, I'm content with that. Is there anything else from anybody before we close this session? Right, in that case then, I shall draw this session to a close. Thank you very much, everyone, for your participation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mum. All the best. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you, Mr. Lucas.
Thank you.